I want to add a personal note. It's been a great pleasure to be associated with Dr. Smith while he's been with us since yesterday. It's been an enormous personal pleasure, and all of us who've had the opportunity to spend significant time with him can testify that we're much the better for it. He's been a gracious guest. We've worked him pretty hard, and he's a good sport and still going strong. But we appreciate his character and his grace with which he has come on this visit. Dr. James K.A. Smith is professor of philosophy at Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where he holds the Gary and Henrietta Biker Chair in Applied Reformed Theology and Worldview. He's also editor of Comment magazine and a senior fellow of the Colossian Forum on Faith, Science, and Culture. Smith is an award-winning author whose books include Introducing Radical Orthodoxy, Who's Afraid of Postmodernism, Desiring the Kingdom, Worship, Worldview, and Cultural Formation, and more recently, Science and the Spirit, Pentecostal Perspectives on the Sciences. His new book, Imagining the Kingdom, How Worship Works, has just been published, and he's currently working on a book-length commentary on Charles Taylor, A Secular Age. I understand that's in now. That's off. His writing has also appeared in magazines such as the Harvard Divinity Bulletin, Christian Century, First Things, and Books and Culture. It's my pleasure to introduce, speaking on the topic Science as Cultural Performance, Leveling the Playing Field in the Theology-Science Conversation, Dr. James K.A. Smith.
Thanks so much.
Appreciate it.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you. It's really an honor, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to be back, to Dr. Faulkner, to the Wheatley Institution. I'm actually really grateful to learn of the Wheatley Institution. The mission of the Wheatley Institution is something that resonates a lot with work that I am doing, and glad to be part of this series. I've also enjoyed, this is my second time here, and once again have enjoyed wonderful conversation with faculty, and this time also with students. Bright, sharp, curious students, so that's always refreshing. So it doesn't feel like work. So I don't know if is there an outline? Do people have an outline in their hands? Yeah? Okay, great, brilliant. That's really just a doodle on a little bit, but also there's a couple of quotations that, so I'm not just reading at you. If you can follow them on your notes, that would be great. I would like to float just one tiny provocative little claim. Consider it a discussion starter. It's this: that the dialogue between religion and science operates on the basis of a category mistake. In particular, I think that the dominant paradigm in the theology and science conversation plays with loaded dice such that the house always wins. That is, science always wins. Or for more sanctified folks who won't get the gambling metaphor, I suggest one of the dominant paradigms in the theology-science dialogue has set up an unlevel playing field that has put religion in the position of always having to play uphill. This is because in covert ways, religious folks with the best of intentions have bought into a version of scientism. So the goal of my talk this afternoon is to level that playing field by emphasizing the way in which science is a human cultural activity. Now, this angle of approach is rooted in a basic assumption or intuition that I need to first explain. Scientism, of course, can be defined in a number of different ways. On the one hand, scientism could be defined as a reductionism. It reduces the complexity of the cosmos and human life to the narrow purview of what can be measured and arbitrated by the natural sciences. On the other hand, and as really the flip side of that, scientism is also the result of science overstepping its jurisdiction of authority. In other words, science becomes scientism when it overreaches its purview, when, for example, it makes metaphysical pronouncements about naturalism that could never be rooted in empirical data, or when it extrapolates from the material conditions of human consciousness as if those were the only and as if those were sufficient conditions for consciousness, as if biology or neuroscience, for example, are able to canvass all aspects of human consciousness. So I'm working with this baseline assumption that scientism is both reductionistic and overreaching. With that in mind, this afternoon I want to argue that scientism is what happens when we forget that science is a human cultural activity. Just the kind of a cultural activity that cannot be accounted for by the natural sciences, I think. Now, in fact, I think practicing scientists rarely forget this, that science is a human cultural activity. They are way too closely involved in the concrete, material practices of science to ever be tempted to let it become some abstract magisterium that determines all truth. In fact, I think the social sciences are actually more prone to scientism, but I will leave that for the Q&A period, perhaps. Rather, I think that scientism is the result of a story that a secular culture wants to tell about science. So it's less something that scientists are guilty of and more about how science is positioned within our culture. And in many ways, I want to suggest, the contemporary dialogue between theology and science or religion and science actually buys into that story. Unwittingly, perhaps unintentionally. So let me begin by working through what I think are some category mistakes that get this conversation off on the wrong foot. As I said, in many ways, the religion-science dialogue rests on a category mistake because it is operated on the basis of a certain positivism about science. And it's taken the quote-unquote findings of science as if they were the pristine disclosures of nature. Thus, we increasingly encounter familiar tropes about what we now know or what science says, which are all too often followed by then identifying some religious doctrine or dogma that now needs to be abandoned or modified in light of that. Both new atheists and religious scholars often work within the same paradigm. Indeed, some of the features of this paradigm are what we usually associate with liberal Christianity. But I guess actually, to identify where I'm coming from, the reason I've gotten interested in this is I see the exact same tropes amongst Protestant evangelicals, which is kind of my people, in a way. Which is quite surprising, in a sense. And I think it means you could probably predict certain trajectories, but I'll save that for another time too. I suggest that some religious scholars, even those who hold a very high view of Scripture and revelation, have unwittingly bought into aspects of this paradigm. In my own tradition, for example, this has been exhibited in recent debates about evolution, human origins, and the fall, where the implications of an evolutionary account of human origins are thought to then necessarily entail the abandonment of historic theological convictions about sin. But one could consider other cases. For example, often, claims about the material conditions of consciousness are thought to entail a reductionism that precludes historic religious convictions about the soul. And so one can find religious scholars bending over backwards to come up with monistic accounts of the human person in order to satisfy the strictures of what science will admit as plausible. In other words, in many ways, both new atheists and religious scholars share a lot of the same convictions about science. And in many ways, I think those convictions are scientistic. This is because on both ends of that continuum, there is a similar assumption about the nature of science. Science is either the pristine deliverer of the cold, hard, secular truth, or science is the crystal clear lens for disclosing the message of the book of nature. As such, science is taken to be an odd sort of transparent black box. A black box is something where it does something, but you don't know exactly how it works inside. But you know that every time it's going to spit out the results that you want. So it has this black box functionality. We kind of treat science that way a little bit, and it spits out these findings that we then depend upon. So here's the category mistake. While the dialogue is purportedly between science, which really is a constellation of academic disciplines and methods, and purportedly the dialogue is between science and theology, which is, let's say, another academic discipline in some cases. In fact, that's what it claims to be. It claims to be a dialogue between science and theology. In fact, or I would say functionally, the dialogue assumes that religion is a kind of human cultural product, whereas science is merely the conduit for disclosing the cold, hard realities of nature, to which faith must answer, demur, or affirm. After all, who's going to argue with nature? So, like a school child of years ago, we have to suck it up, lay out our hand, and bear the brunt of the strap. Religion needs to be disciplined by the findings of science and submit itself to those cold, hard realities of nature. If this turns out badly for some traditional or fantastic religious claims, then believers have to take that as part of their whipping and leave the principal's office grateful that they've been chastised, since this will make them more intellectually responsible. It's a little, I mean, I could go on, it's a little over the top, but it's kind of, what will scientists let you keep believing? And now we're going to carry out the theology-science dialogue in that way. This configuration sets up an asymmetrical relationship, and this is where it skews the playing field, as I put it earlier. While the conversation claims to be between science and theology, I think functionally it's taken to be a confrontation between nature and culture, with science really just being the pristine conduit of nature, whereas it's theology that gives you interpretations, and it's mushy and it's soft, and that's what needs to be disciplined. That is a category mistake. In fact, a dialogue between science and theology is always already a dialogue between culture and culture, both of which are confronted then and constrained by and answer to a certain givenness that we often describe as nature. So I've tried to capture this in a couple of really clunky little, I can't even call them diagrams on your outline there, but there's a sense in which both science and religion are grappling with a reality that pushes back on both of them equally. It's not that science has sort of an edge as this pristine conduit. I think the theology-science conversation has tended to ignore the fact, then, that science is a cultural institution. Now, by a cultural institution, I mean that science is a product of human making. It's a contingent product of poiesis. So I want you to hear, when I say culture and cultural, I want you to hear the verb cultivate, making, unpacking. So to say that something is a cultural institution is to say that it is the product of human making. Okay? Culture is the unfolding of potentialities that are latent or implicit in nature. So aspects of culture are the fruit of human making and unfolding. They are not natural kinds. A painting by Picasso, an elementary school, a Boeing 747, and a political constitution are all examples of culture, of human making. They are not naturally occurring entities that one would bump into if there weren't human agents that had unfolded and brought them into being. So cultural institutions then are networks of practices, habits, and material environments that are that product of human making. A hospital is a cultural institution that's unfolded by a human community and is composed of both a particular built environment, there's a space in which it happened, there's ERs and ORs and ambulances and CAT scan machines and so on. But a hospital is also this network of practices and traditions that are learned by apprenticeship, the disciplines of surgery and medicine, the traditions of care that define nursing. So hospitals don't fall from the sky, nor do they simply crawl up from the lagoon and the La Brea tar pits. They emerge as products of human cultural collaboration and making, which means that they are essentially historical, contingent, and unfolded over time. How are we doing? Okay? Is everybody with me? So that's what I mean by a cultural institution. Now, it seems to me that a lot of the science-religion conversation happily acknowledges that religion is a cultural institution. Indeed, how could one not? Theology is a product of religious traditions and communities, which are themselves paradigmatic instances of cultural institutions that are historical, contingent, and certainly not natural. Even if they are launched by a supernatural impetus, they have unfolded over time. They have unfolded differently in different places. They could have unfolded otherwise. So theology as a cultural institution is recognized as a kind of hermeneutic of reality in this religion science conversation. Religion is a take on things. It offers an interpretation of the world. It's shaped by different traditions and presuppositions. From the perspective of this dominant paradigm, this means that theology is sort of one step back from reality, right? It's always an interpretation. It's a cultural institution that ascribes meaning to reality or nature, whereas science is sort of functionally taken to be a disclosure of reality as such. Again, I don't think scientists think this way. I think that theologians who come to science tend to treat it that way. I suggest that this fails to appreciate that science is also a cultural institution. Science is not a naturally occurring entity like igneous rocks or seahorses. That is, science is not something that emerges from the swamp or falls from the sky apart from human making. Science is a network also like that hospital. It's a network of material practices, built environments, traditions of apprenticeship, learned rituals that emerged over time in particular configurations in different places. So any conversation between science and religion is never going to be simply a matter of getting theology to face up to nature. It's always already a cross-cultural dialogue in a sense. It's a cross-cultural institution dialogue, at least. It's a conversation between two different cultural institutions, each with their own traditions, practices, built environments, meaning systems. But because of its lingering positivism, the theology-science dialogue, at least as I tend to see it operating, in really strange ways, is operating in isolation from a vast and growing literature on science as culture. The history of science has almost no role to play in the current science-theology dialogue. And it's like, because it's not owning up to the contingency of those scientific institutions. So there's fascinating, and I apologize, I forgot the name of the philosopher this afternoon that I met at lunch, but you have an expert here on campus who gets this. The history of science, so who is it? David Grandy. The history of science is the way to wake up to the nature of science as a cultural institution. If you ignore the history of science, it makes it a lot easier to treat science scientistically. Because it's like you'll forget its origin. It becomes a kind of pure, transcendent, secular magisterium that just makes these pronouncements that now you have to bow down to and accept. The philosopher Robert Brandom at Pittsburgh articulates the distinction between nature and culture as a distinction between things that have natures and things that have histories. So while the stuff of physics have a nature, physics, as a discipline of scientific study, has a history. So it's very important to not confuse physics with the physical. Okay. So the encounter between theology and science is not equivalent to an encounter between theology and nature. It's a way to that conversation, but it's not the same thing. Joseph Rouse, in a quotation I give you, this is quote number 1 on your outline if you have it there. Joseph Rouse, I think, is a very significant, important philosopher of science who is kind of completely absent from the theology science conversation. At one point he says this: scientific practices are often construed as apart from any surrounding culture, and free even from culture. But such construals are not adequate to the richness and complexity of scientific work. Recognizing the intimate entanglement of the sciences with other practices does not diminish or blunt their significance, but instead acknowledges their pervasiveness throughout the world. So my point here, and I hope you'll hear this, this is not a debunking project. That is, I'm not pointing out that science is a cultural institution in order to dismiss it or give us permission to ignore it. Rather, the point is to situate science as a cultural institution in order to clarify this category mistake and thereby start to level this playing field for the conversation. So, let's think secondly, what difference did that make? Science takes practice. What would it mean to appreciate science as culture, as a cultural institution? What are the implications? I want to note just a few. First of all, I do think that this would level the playing field. As I've already indicated, one important implication of recognizing science as culture is leveling the playing field in the theology-science dialogue. While it might be the case that theology must be rightly constrained by the givenness of nature, that is, I do think it's important for religious communities to honestly feel the pressures of what the evidences of the physical world seem to be saying to us. Okay, I think that's really that's a virtue of intellectual honesty. There is a way in which the world pushes back on some of our claims. But that is not the same thing as saying that theology must bow at the feet of science. We need to recognize a distinction between science and nature, a distinction that is too often erased. Science is not just some transparent magnifying glass or pristine conduit that delivers nature as it really is. Science is a cultural institution. Now, it is the cultural institution that is particularly attentive to nature. That's its calling. That is what science is supposed to be doing. It's interested in describing and perhaps even explaining nature. And it exposes itself. I think of science as a constellation of practices and disciplines by which we kind of expose ourselves to nature's pushback through the rigors and discipline of experimentation and observation. But that doesn't make science natural. It remains a cultural layer of human making and human meaning making. And in this respect, it is in the same boat as theology and sociology and literature. And, do you know what I mean? This is the level playing field. So theology should no longer feel that it has to defer to science as if it was thereby subjecting itself to nature or reality. While theological claims are rightly disciplined by the ways in which the givenness of the world pushes back on our claims, this is not synonymous with being disciplined by science. Second, I think that we should appreciate the role of practices in the sciences. The theology-science conversation should also stop thinking of science as some static body of findings and instead consider science as a dynamic process of finding. The science in the theology-science dialogue is a remarkably disembodied phenomenon, as if there were no laboratories, instruments, or communities. Instead, but we need to realize science is not just the results, the data sets, or the images that get produced at the end of a very long process. Nor is science just a matter of theory. Rather, science is perhaps best identified as the practices that yield that fruit. Science is a deeply social, communal project composed of material practices and rituals that are handed on as traditions, absorbed as habits, and enacted in experimental performance that literally create worlds. It's not a mistake. One of the, I think many would agree, one of the most influential books in philosophy of science in the 20th century was Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, in which was sort of the beginning in some ways of owning up to this contingency of science. And so he's describing, in a way, the institutions of the natural sciences, how they work. And you will, if you go back and read, this was published in, the second edition was in 1970. If you go back and read it with eyes that are looking for religious language, you will find all kinds of language of novices, apprenticeships, rituals, beliefs. It's very interesting in which, historically, when you would become a Christian, you would go through a novitiate, which was like a really rigorous process of apprenticeship by which you would be enfolded into the community. Thomas Kuhn's description of scientific endeavor maps perfectly onto that. It's a deeply ritualistic immersion into a community of practice. In that way, science is not unlike religion. The philosopher Robert Crease emphasizes that science is not just theory. It is actually defined by experimentation, and that experimentation, he says, is a kind of performing art. This is quote 2 on your outline. A scientific entity does not show up in a laboratory the way an airplane shows up on a radar screen, a fully formed thing out there in the world whose presence is made known to us by a representation. Nor is a scientific entity like a smaller version of the airplane, which could be perceptible if only scaled up large enough. Nor, finally, is a scientific entity like some distant and unknown object on the radar screen that, when closer, becomes perceptible. A scientific entity becomes perceptible only in the performance of the experimentation. So while science seeks to be disciplined by nature, there is also a sense in which science creates its own phenomena. And actually, a lot of experimentation would be totally messed up if nature actually showed up. Right? In other words, a lot of experimentation works precisely by sealing off the vagaries and randomness and messiness of nature and actually creating a really artificial environment that discloses and homes in on one aspect of nature. And it actually controls everything else. So there's a lot of, one way some people will put it this way, science is actually less discovery than you might think, and more making, right? It constitutes its world through experimental performance, which is a learned performance requiring its own set of virtues and skills, deft employment of instrumentation, and a kind of know-how that is not theoretical and perhaps not even intellectual. One of my best friends is a physicist who worked with 2 Nobel Prize-winning physicists in France. And he'll take me down to his lab in the basement of the physics department every once in a while. And he like slows down atoms in some tank so that he can take pictures of really, really slow moving atoms to see how they relate to one another. And the table, and he does this using lasers, and so the table is full of all these tiny mirrors that he has to bounce the laser light in such a way to get it at a certain speed to then be caught in this, I don't know. I'm a philosopher. But there's something really funky going on here. And when he takes my classes down there, he says, I'm a physicist. I spend most of my time in my lab adjusting mirrors. Do you know what I mean? Like there's something actually very tactile and manual about the work that makes scientific finding possible. Third theme. We need to recognize that scientific practices are meaning-giving practices. They are interpretive practices. This priority of practice to theory should make us attentive to the nature of scientific practices. And I think that's actually part of Joseph Rouse's landmark work. Rouse emphasizes a normative understanding of practices that attunes us to just how loaded scientific practices or experimentative practices are. What a practice is, he says, including what counts as an instance of the practice is bound up with its significance in terms of what is at issue and what is at stake. So Rouse's point is this. Embedded in a practice is already some implicit understanding of what is at issue for us and what is at stake for us. And to have a sense of what's at issue and what's at stake is to be in the realm of normativity. Because those are what matters questions. And so Rouse is emphasizing, look, every scientific practice already comes loaded with a sense of what's at issue and what's at stake. They're not neutral practices. By the way, that doesn't mean they're evil practices. We're just saying they're not neutral practices. Not that there's anything wrong with that. You know, that's kind of the point. This is the basis for Rouse's core thesis. Practices matter. Practices matter. Practices have something at issue and something at stake. So he says, one has not understood a practice unless one has grasped the point of the practice, that is, what's at issue. This means that scientific practices are not just pure conduits of a given world of facts, they are world constituting. It is practices which give meaning, and thus scientific practices as cultural institutions are as meaning-giving as those of theology. So we have to reconnoiter how we have traditionally understood the theology-science distinction. Scientific practices are not merely passive observational practices that simply yield the facts. Like theology, they also give meaning. They render significance. The encounter between religion and science, then, can't be some division of labor where, oh, well, science gives us the facts and religion and theology comes along and adds meaning to them. No. While I don't think there is an inherent conflict between religious faith and science, especially if we simply understand science as the human cultural practice of attending to and understanding the natural world, I don't think there's any inherent conflict between religious faith and that project. We do need to recognize that there can be conflict between the different meanings they assign to the natural world. And such conflicts arise precisely when we're dealing less with science and more with scientism. Sometimes in our eagerness to dispatch with simplistic, unproductive models that posit a battle between science and faith, we too quickly look to reconcile what really are competing visions of the world, because the scientific practices come loaded with a sense of what's at issue and what's at stake. Recognizing science as culture should at least grant us permission to demur from the magisterial authority that science assumes in its disclosure of the so-called facts of the matter. But it should also enable us to recognize when science as a cultural institution begins to assume roles that other cultural institutions have generally assumed. I don't think it's too outlandish to suggest that scientism excuse me, is a way to describe the cultural phenomenon whereby science takes over the role of religion, begins to function as a religion that offers ultimate explanation. So this is we're in the home stretch here, thankfully for my voice. This is where I want to make a closing analysis about scientism as the master narrative of exclusive humanism. That's why you're here, to hear terms like that, right? So I want to explain this last claim which I just made, which is that in some ways I think you could say scientism is a way to describe the cultural phenomenon whereby science takes over the role of religion in a secular culture. That is, it begins to function as a religion because it offers ultimate explanations. The Catholic philosopher Charles Taylor, I should say Catholic and Canadian philosopher since I'm Canadian, in his monumental genealogy of our secular age, provides some tools, I think, for us to understand how this happened. On Taylor's account, scientism is exactly scientism is exactly what exclusive humanism needs. Now, I should back up a sec. For Taylor, exclusive humanism is a worldview, you could say, that emerges in modernity that claims to be able to make sense of the totality of the cosmos and human significance without any appeal to transcendence. Okay? So it was a way of coming up with a sort of philosophy of the meaning of life that was totally immanent to this world. It was totally temporal and makes no reference and actually denies the reality of transcendence. So exclusive humanism is like a secular meaning system. It's a secular way of answering the question, what does this all mean? And in a way, scientism is kind of what exclusive humanism needs, and a way to account for what's ultimate without any appeal to transcendent. An account of the way things are that is solidly within what Taylor calls this immanent frame. This is why the Enlightenment is still very much with us, despite our so-called postmodern moment. Taylor diagnoses its endurance in our secular age through a fascinating little psychoanalysis, you could say, of a convert. So imagine what Taylor does is he wants to give you a kind of an account of a convert. But the convert he wants to analyze is not someone who converts from unbelief to belief in transcendence. He's going to give you the account of somebody who used to believe in transcendence and converts to exclusive humanism. Does that make sense? So it's like conversion to unbelief. Here's his way of putting it. If someone tells you that they've converted to unbelief because of science, don't believe them. Because what's usually captured them is not scientific evidence per se, but what he calls the form of science. Indeed, he says, the appeal of scientific materialism is not so much the cogency of its detailed findings as that of the underlying epistemological stance, and that actually is attractive for ethical reasons of a certain skewed sort. It is seen, that is this perspective, as the stance of maturity, of courage, of manliness, over against childish fears and sentimentality. So you can understand how that goes. I used to believe those kinds of supernatural things when I was a child. But I'm no longer a child. I've grown up. I'm mature. I'm rational. I'm scientific. I don't believe those things anymore, and I don't need them. So you can also understand how, but notice Taylor is saying, and so what will happen is there'll be all kinds of appeals to like science as what drove somebody to convert to that. But actually, if you start sort of pushing on the story, it turns out that the real empirical evidences of the sciences didn't have much function at all. Instead, it was a story that could be told about one's being scientific and rational. This is exactly the dynamic that the Richard Dawkins of the world play on, right? It's really a story of maturity, growing up and being rational and thereby looking down on the others. You can also understand how, on the retelling, the convert to unbelief will want to give the impression that it was the scientific evidence that was doing the work. Whereas really it's more like, I want to be associated with people who think that science tells us the truth about the world, the whole truth. And the belief that they've converted from has usually been, to be honest, a very immature faith that could be easily toppled. So while such converts to unbelief tell them stories about growing up and facing reality, and thus paint belief as essentially immature and childish, their testimony, this conversion to unbelief testimony, Taylor says, usually betrays the simplistic shape of the faith that they've abandoned. He puts it this way: if our faith has remained at the stage of the immature images, then the story that materialism equals maturity can seem plausible. It's actually why, this might make us a bit uncomfortable, but it's actually why, in some ways, feeling the pressure of that alternative might be a catalyst for maturing in our faith, right? But in fact, their conversion to unbelief was also a conversion to a new faith, what he calls faith in science's ability. So it's not like they're not believers anymore, they just believe in something else. Such tales of maturity and growing up to face reality are stories of courage, the courage to face the fact that the universe is without transcendent meaning, without eternal purpose, without supernatural significance. So the convert to belief has grown up because she can handle the truth that our disenchanted world is a cold, hard place. And at the same time, there can be something exhilarating, he says, in this loss of purpose, because if nothing matters and we have the courage to face this, then we have a kind of Epicurean invulnerability, While such a universe might have nothing to offer us by way of comfort, it's also true that in such a universe, nothing is demanded of us. So there's this weird kind of liberation that is felt within this immanent frame. And so Taylor says, we arrive at a new place in human history. A race of humans has arisen which has managed to experience its world as entirely immanent. In some respect, this is Taylor's commentary, we may judge this achievement as a victory for darkness. But it is a remarkable achievement nonetheless. That's actually what fascinates Taylor, is that, wow, in 500 years, we managed to create this incredibly powerful meaning system that thinks that you can make sense of being human and the cosmos without any appeal to transcendence. That is quite an accomplishment. It's a victory for the darkness, but it's quite an accomplishment. But, and here I'll conclude, Taylor also gives us reason to suspect that scientism is ultimately not viable. As he would put it, there is a fullness, a persistent transcendence that haunts us, even in our secular age. So such a closed take on the world can't seem to get rid of a certain haunting, a certain rumbling in our hearts. There is a specter haunting our secular age, he says, the specter of meaninglessness, which is, in a sense, a dispatch from fullness. I wish we had more time to talk about this, but Taylor thinks all of the kind of existential anxieties that our age is beset with is actually a way that transcendence is making its presence felt through the dis-ease that we feel. And because this won't go away, but rather keeps pressing and pulling, it generates unease and restlessness. Now, I would suggest that pressure tends to make scientism shout all the more loudly. But we can bear witness to transcendence not by shouting back, but by patiently, carefully pointing out the problem with scientism, thereby leveling the playing field and making room for our age to hear a still small voice that whispers beyond the molecules, inviting us to so much more. Thanks very much. Myself, we have time for comments, questions, pushback, disagreements, celebrations. And if you could use the microphone, it would help for others to hear. It's all anticipated, all questions, concerns, answered ahead of time. Yes, sir. I think so.
I'm Steve Turley. I'm a physicist.
Great.
So I'm looking at this kind of from
Yes.
the other side of the fence. And I think you make a good point of the cultural aspects of the scientific method. And those of us that do it, we're immersed in it all the time.
Yeah.
But you didn't make much of a point, I think, of the natural aspects of theology. I think just as science has to touch base with the natural world, in theology we've got some equivalent things in Revelation and in Scripture and things like that. And it's not just interpretation. We have to have something to interpret. And so
Yes.
I think both camps have a cultural aspect and a natural
That's great.
aspect
So
that
could we
brings
put it? Yeah, because I was trying to figure out how to include that. In a way, what we could say is both theology and the sciences are disciplines that are trying to account for the reality that pushes back on us. But actually, a core conviction here is that included in that reality of the cosmos is the voice of God, the reality of revelation, the authority of, right? So that's also part of kind of the furniture of our universe that we are grappling with. Yeah, absolutely. It's a great point.
So this is kind of a follow-up question to that.
Yeah.
How do we reimagine faith or Christianity or religion as a humbled agent in the world? You mentioned not shouting back,
Yeah.
but other forms of imagining that engagement. Because it seems like we're critiquing sort of the oracle nature
Yeah.
of now science,
Yep.
but religion, particularly Christianity in the West, has had that oracle stance for a very long period of time. So how do we change that stance?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, because we can't just say, well, here's the other magisterium that you're supposed to now just definitely. I think the mission and task of bearing witness in a secular age is giving people ways to name what they have been feeling but they haven't been able to name. Do you know, at least that's totally what Charles Taylor is doing in a secular age. So, I mean, I don't mean that we shouldn't proclaim. We should absolutely proclaim. But our proclamations should be extended as invitations. Here's how to come be human. Right? This is what you were made for. This is where you will find the channels and the grooves that you were made to sort of run in that will lead to a sense of flourishing and significance. That you have to kind of meet people where they are and say, because you've been wondering about that, haven't you? Right? I've just been struck working through. I'm sorry, I'm so close to this book right now because I just finished this project. But you'll see Taylor. Taylor doesn't offer proofs for Christian belief. Instead, he'll say is, I think Christianity tells a story about who we are and about the world we live in that helps you make sense of the pressures, existential pressures that you have felt. And I just think that takes us out of the shouting match between the new atheists and the apologetic responses to it. I just see that as completely unconstructive. It's also, Cardinal Ratzinger, right before he became Pope Benedict XVI, said, the church's most powerful witness and apologetic is her saints and her artists. There's something, this is, in other words, I think the power is communicated aesthetically and as the beautiful. And I think communities of practice also can embody a sort of beauty, and people say, what's going on there? Is that in the ballpark of your question? Yeah.
Sorry if nobody else.
No, that's absolutely.
So you're really elevating both the ethos and the pathos, not just the logos.
Exactly. You put it so much better than I.
Okay.
In fact, I need to write that down because you just helped me figure it out. Yeah, exactly. And I think what happened was, for me, modernity is the absolute prioritization of logos.
Yeah, it's the domination.
Which then Christianity also bought into,
Right.
which is why it thought it had to play this at the level of apologetics.
Okay, so this is kind of an insider question, but so this is the problem. This is why you disagree with Pete Enns, right? Is
Wow. Yeah.
you think Pete is sucked into that idea of scientism's premises?
I do think. I think a lot of folks in that conversation. But I also think that his own discipline, he has not adequately interrogated the modernist assumptions of the discipline that he's been inculcated into.
Okay.
Does that help? Yeah. Yeah. Great. Wow. Yes, sir.
Well, first of all, I agree with you completely about the category mistake claim.
Yeah.
And that seems, in fact, patently obvious whenever you listen to any of these discussions that mistake is being made. But I think in following up maybe on my colleague's comment, I'd maybe push that point even a little further and say that perhaps the reason why religious believers are so apt to making that mistake is because they misunderstand the nature of religion. I mean, it seems to me that you could make the very same claims. Everything you said today about science, that it's a cultural institution, that it produces beliefs, you can say about religion, right? So, but when believers look at religion from the inside, it seems to me that they see religious facts, right? I mean, revealed facts that pop up from the ground in the same way that they understand this happening in science.
Yes.
So rather than, for example, seeing disputes between different interpretive camps in Christianity, you have one camp who sees their beliefs as the revealed truths, which are hard facts, and everyone who disagrees with them as those who simply refuse to be enlightened rather than as a different interpretive position. Do you think, or no?
Yeah, no. I think that's, I would also say, in the same way that this analysis of science as a cultural institution is not meant to be a debunking project, right? It's not meant to like pull the rug out from under the importance of science. I also don't think owning up to the cultural nature of religious communities thereby naturalizes them either, right? In other words, so the God's launching of religious communities by supernatural revelation is not mutually exclusive to also recognizing that religious traditions are human cultural communities of tradition and that God inhabits those contingencies as well. Absolutely. It's funny, I think one of the reasons this conversation has gone so poorly in a way is because we've intellectualized everything, right? So the theologians actually just think of science as what the findings that are produced from it and ignore all the cultural practices that produce it. And similarly, they have been unappreciative of the significance of practice for religious identity as well. Yeah, it's a great point. It's great.
Thanks for your stimulating presentation. One of the concerns I have that I haven't heard you address, and I'd like to propose it, is that, well, I can accept a lot of this. Some of the debate seems to be on something else, driven by something else, and that is the claims that science is progressive, science is moving ahead. And you look at religion and you can say, religion isn't moving ahead, and especially, I mean, you could look at least some kinds of theological debates that can be kind of silly at times, and also squabbles among, sects and so forth. I mean, in a way, it's probably time for Christians to stop beating each other up.
Yes.
Recognizing the real enemy isn't each other; it's it's the non-believer, or at least the challenge is with the non-believers and so on. But despite all, I mean, but let me bring it back to that. That I think people who are believe that science holds the answers to everything can point to the fact that science is moving forward. And it's a lot harder to say that of religion, spirituality, and so forth. And how do you answer that kind of a challenge? That kind of challenge?
That's a great question. Because I think precisely one of the aspects of science's cultural accomplishment is its explanatory and predictive power. I mean, you just can't deny that it it's been progressive because it's been able to be predictive in some ways. I think, I'm thinking on my feet here, I don't think what I would try to do is make the case that religion has been progressive. I don't think I would do that. What I would probably do is try to point out that whatever progress science has yielded us has not in any way been a one-to-one correspondence to cultural progress. What do you think? In other words, I'm not at all convinced that we live better as human beings today because of the progressive accomplishments of science. And if you pressed me and if the tape was off, I might actually entertain the alternative thesis, which is it actually might have made things a little bit worse. I mean, I understand that I love penicillin and airplanes and things like that, but there are other dynamics to consider about human meaning.
Yeah, just, I mean, as a historical point, I think that was one of the messages of Epicureanism was that, hey, you can make this technological progress, but it doesn't necessarily make people happier. Now, still, I have to say, I mean, I'm strongly inclined to think we're a whole lot better off with science than without it. And life is a lot less
It is not nasty, brutish, and
It's
short anymore.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
it's a lot better. And I don't think we want to get on that side of the debate that science doesn't do anything. But
That's not
do
what I
think-
was saying,
yeah,
right?
no.
Yeah.
But I mean, we have to be careful
Yes,
here. And
yes.
I think, again, I'm not sure how to deal with this. I mean, one of the things I would say, and again, is just that I do think there's a tendency, I think, of the scientific types to say nobody else is doing anything. But I think, again, the progress isn't that dramatic, perhaps. But if you look over the history of human ethics, I think we're the best it's ever been in terms of people actually caring about other people, treating all other people as human beings.
Now you sound like
instead
Steven
of,
Pinker.
And
Yeah.
I think there are other areas. There are lots of areas where there has been, you might say, broader cultural progress in values, ethics, and so on. And I think it's quite possible there could be and should be progress in religion, but I think we have to be careful that we don't get, that at least we ought to be contributing to the forward progress here and not.
I'm totally with you, and I don't. And I think the great temptation is, I also don't want to fall into some nostalgic, romanticism about the past. But I would just put it so, and without, on all kinds of measures, lifespan, nutrition, all those kinds of things, without question, recognize progress. And I think that those are goods that God cares about. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think that's closer to the way that God wants his world to work. But I also just think there's another layer of analysis here in which this is a bit ham-fisted. But I also think it then becomes a world that is beset with actually more insidious idolatries. In other words, it's precisely in the world that is tempted to think that there is no meaning beyond the immanent frame. And so if you're evaluating those on that level, someone could still say there's some grave concerns about the byproducts, unintentional byproducts or something.
Just as one little footnote, I think it's marvelous that Francis Bacon in The Great Consideration talks about how he sees science as helping usher in the millennium, the new age, and so forth. And he sees science as a way that God has blessing humanity.
Yeah.
From our perspective, we can do that.
Yeah.
We have to kind of expand our horizon.
Yeah. And just to fill out the story, I mean, I really do believe to be made in God's image is actually to be commissioned to do culture making. I think that's what's going on in Genesis 1 and 2. It's God plants us in the earth and then gives us the task of cultivating creation to unfurl and unpack. And I think science is part of that. It's just that then there are different ways that it can be unfolded that we're talking about. Sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick comment. I mean, speaking about progress, and because you talked about how as a cultural institution, science has to answer those questions: what's at issue and what's at stake?
Yeah.
And progress is one of the things that is at issue. It's part of that normativity.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe for religion, we think we have a different relation to progress, and it's not the primary thing that's at issue.
Well, and the interesting thing is progress is not a value neutral term.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we would have to talk about is what counts as progress. And what counts as, because that's an evaluative term, what counts as progress is always going to be relative to standards of excellence that are coming from somewhere, an ethos, you might say. So now the question is, well, what is the ethos that is informing the norms and criteria by which we now count this as progress? And that's probably the realm where there would be a debate. Yeah. Great point. Thanks.
Where do you think morality comes into play with this? I know this is probably a tangent to this whole discussion.
Not a tangent,
but
a little broad,
Just with this concept of a level playing field, and as you were speaking earlier about the psychoanalysis of the convert to the unbelief, and where do you think that let me. I had a discussion last night with
Okay.
an agnostic, and I asked him what he thought morality was. And
Yeah.
he said to me that it was based on human constructs, which to me is not true. I am a believer in rationalism and whatever it may be. Where do you think this balance between scientism and theology can agree on morality?
See, some people would make an appeal at this point to what would sometimes be called natural law, where they would think that there are sort of discernible features and standards of moral expectation and criteria that are kind of universally discernible. I believe that God's creation has moral norms inscribed into it, and that humans flourish when they conform to God's moral norms. I don't have as much confidence that those can just be universally appreciated apart from revelation. I don't know what that does. I don't know how you all think about that. But so now that said, nonetheless, you might still be able to bear witness and make a case for, because if part of it is, part of the wager here is that actually God's laws, God's moral laws, are not arbitrary, and they're actually conducive to making us what we are made to be. So if you follow those laws, it's like you're kind of running with the grain of the universe, and it's conducive to flourishing. So people might not accept the moral norms as articulations of God's law, but you nonetheless might be able to make the case for those moral norms by demonstrating that, in fact, these are conducive to flourishing. So that's a little bit, for example, of how I would make a case for marriage in a pluralistic nation state. Ultimately, I think marriage is between a man and a woman because that is what Revelation indicates, and that's what the church has taught. But that means nothing in a secular republic. So how do you now start thinking about, someone like Robbie George is going to appeal to natural law and things like that. All kinds of Thomists do that. I think there are other ways to still have a public discourse about those standards, but make this kind of flourishing appeal, which is not a knockdown, drag-out proof or argument. You know, it's messy.
I just I guess more.
Oh, sorry, I totally didn't
No,
answer your
that
question.
was
Okay.
great. It got me thinking about divine command ethics.
Yeah,
and
right.
that idea,
Right.
natural law, of course, and it was interesting with the conversation with my friend. Of course, I completely respected his belief. However, it was interesting that
But you believed he was wrong.
Yes. Well, he believes that he can't prove it.
Okay, yeah.
You know, this agnosticism or whatever, but that's a completely different discussion. But he made the point that believing in punishment or reward, you know, certainly this flourishment,
Yep.
whatever it may be, it does not compel him to be better, doesn't impel judgment or whatever it might be. And I just thought that was very interesting because
Yeah.
he definitely believes in this Scientology and just
Right.
It got me thinking throughout this whole.
Sure.
If we're going to level the playing field,
Yeah.
where is this flourishment?
What works for one person is different than thinking about what works to be able to make a case for a policy to a pluralistic group. It's a little bit more anecdotal about what will sort of work for a particular person. That's great. Thanks. Oh, last question. Congratulations. You win.
So this is just a question for clarity's sake, but in your discussion on category mistakes, you defined both science and theology as cultural institutions in order to level the playing field. And my question was, if there is a theology or a religion that was instituted by deity and dictated by deity to this day, would that religion or theology still be considered a cultural institution by your definition?
I think so, because it's like now you can have a strong account of the dynamics of divine-human interaction going on in the unfolding of that. But so I want to emphasize that these are not mutually exclusive claims. It's not either a cultural institution or it's divine. It is a divinely instituted cultural institution that, in some significant sense, I think LDS folks would love this, humans have a responsibility to cultivate and unfold well, right? Does that sound right? I'm getting the agency point. So you know, there is this interaction between the two. And so it's not meant to be naturalistic to say that it's a human cultural institution. Yeah,
Thank you.
great. Thanks for clarifying that. Thanks, everyone.